You have probably heard of Bruce, right? And by that I mean Bruce Wayne, of course. Uh, if you are a little bit familiar with DC Comics, you know that Bruce Wayne is the character behind that superhero Batman, right? As a child, Bruce was leaving the theater with his parents one night in the city of Gotham, and they were walking down an alley. And a criminal accosts the family to try and rob them, take some of their possessions, but unfortunately, he takes more than just possessions. He takes the lives of Bruce's parents. And because of that tragedy, Bruce embarks on a journey, right? A journey to become a vigilante, investing a great deal of money and pretty much all of his time and seek for justice. And in this identity-seeking journey of Bruce, he ends up becoming Batman, the masked superhero who helps the police fight crime and vice at night in the violent city of Gotham. What started out as an act of violence resulted in the forging of a hero, and according to the perspective of the creators of DC Comics, in the safety of Gotham. Now, when we come to the final stretch in the book of Genesis, we come across an act of violence that actually resulted in something good. Now, different from the plot in the DC Comics series, in the book of Genesis, the act of violence actually happened. Also, in the book of Genesis, the mastermind is not a human creator, but the creator of the universe. It is God himself behind every action. He's the one who controls all the events in the plot, including the evil ones, and directs them all to accomplish, ultimately, his purposes. I invite you to open your Bibles to Genesis 37, if you're not there yet, as we continue our series on the book of Genesis. And in this chapter, we find the beginning of the narrative section involving Joseph, one of the 12 sons of the patriarch Jacob. This section goes from Genesis 37 to the end of the book, chapter 50. Now, it is true that Joseph takes center stage over here in many of these chapters, but don't be mistaken. This section still addresses the third patriarch, Jacob. And allow for some nerdiness at this point, because I believe that the structure of the book of Genesis helps us understand a little bit better what the message of this final portion is and what it's actually dealing with. Okay, so the compiler of the book of Genesis organized the entire material of the book around one Hebrew word called toledot in Hebrew. And this word can mean generations or offspring. Okay, and it occurs about 10 times in the book. And so the compiler of the book used that word at specific headings of sections in the book, okay, to tell us what happened to a certain thing or a certain person. When we carefully observe, as you can see over there on the slide, when we carefully observe the use of that word throughout the entire book of Genesis, we see that it's a literary device to move from the broad to the specific. As the narrative progresses, everything narrows down to one family, okay, and to certain individuals. So, of course, we get started with the preface of creation, but we go to the generations or the offspring or what happened to the heavens and the earth. Right? And then from heavens and the earth, we go to Adam, which is the first human being. And then from Adam, we go to Noah, right? And after Noah, we go to Shem. Now, one of the sons of Noah. It's narrowing down from universe to humankind, and then to specific individuals and descendants of Adam. And now Noah and his son Shem, out of 3. And after Shem, we now have a focus on 3 individuals, of course, who are the 3 patriarchs, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God not only makes a covenant with these people, these 3 individuals, but he also determines that he will, this is important, he will preserve the offspring, the seed of these three men. Okay? So he makes a covenant with them and vows to preserve their offspring. When we get to Genesis 37, we read in verse 2, these are the generations, or these are the Toledot of Jacob. So this is the beginning of a new section in the book that deals with the offspring of Jacob. So the author, or God here, is telling us this is what happened to the generations, or the offspring, or the family of Jacob. And we are moving our focus now to his offspring. In the previous chapters, if you rewind a little bit over there, you will remember that we learned about God's dealings with Jacob himself, how God ratified his covenant that he started with Abraham, went through Isaac, now with Jacob. And we studied all the messed up behavior of Jacob and his brother Esau. But God, by his grace, establishes his covenant with Jacob. Now in this final section, it's not about the covenant itself, it's about preserving the offspring that will inherit and transmit that covenant. Does that make sense? Okay? So that family will perpetuate Abraham's covenant. And the Lord will use one person to do that, to preserve Jacob's offspring, and that person is Joseph. All right? And I'm going over this because our following sermons will be on the next chapters. And it's all dealing with the preservation of the seed of Jacob through Joseph, by the hands of Joseph. In our chapter today, chapter 37, we see God starting to use Joseph in the preservation of Jacob's offspring. More specifically, we witness God using the sinful family dynamic in the house of Jacob to preserve the offspring of Jacob. So if you're going to walk out today having written something, I would like you to write down this thought here, which is the main point. We learn in this chapter that God sovereignly uses sinful actions of fallen sinners for the good of his people. God sovereignly uses sinful actions of fallen sinners for the good of his people. In this particular chapter, 37, God sovereignly uses hatred and jealousy. Hatred and jealousy of the brothers of Joseph towards him. Now, we do have the entire chapter 37 to go over this morning. And we will read the biblical text as we progress in our study. But I will keep things simple for us this morning. I will divide the chapter into two main parts. The first part is hatred and jealousy in the making. And that goes from verse 1 to verse 11, okay? Everything that will happen to Joseph in the following chapters will happen because of hatred and jealousy of his brothers towards him. Everything gets started because of hatred and jealousy. So perhaps you might be asking, why do his brothers hate him? Why do they nurture jealousy towards him? And the text gives us two reasons. So let's read verses 1 to 4. Okay? The first reason being Joseph was the recipient of preferential love from Jacob. So Genesis 37, verse 1 to 4. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when the brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. So the first reason for hatred and jealousy, Joseph was the recipient of preferential love from Jacob. Jacob caused jealousy and hatred among his sons. Notice that Joseph himself had no control over the situation, right? Joseph didn't do anything necessarily to deserve the preferential treatment that he received. The reason Jacob loved him was because he was the son of his old age, but he was the son of Rachel, the wife that he loved the most, right? Joseph was loved for who he was. In the same way, Joseph didn't do anything necessarily evil to deserve hatred and jealousy from his brothers. We read in verse 2 that he was bringing bad report of his brothers to the father. And some believe that this means that Joseph was a 17-year-old tattletale, but I don't think that's true. If we read the following chapters, we get a good glimpse of his character, right? Joseph is portrayed throughout the entire narrative as someone who does what's right, who fears the Lord. He's not perfect, but he fears the Lord. In any case, we read in verse 4 that the hatred and jealousy of his brothers were the result of Jacob's preferential treatment for Joseph. And to make matters worse, Jacob decided to seal that with a robe of many colors or a long sleeve robe. The Hebrew is ambiguous over there. So if you grew up drawing coloring a very colorful robe, that might not be accurate, but it might be. Who knows? But we don't know exactly if it was a colorful robe or a long sleeve, long robe. But it was a robe. It was a piece of clothing that would distinguish Joseph as somebody who stood out among all his 10 brothers, older brothers. Every time his brothers saw him wearing that robe, what do you think happened in their hearts and minds? It stirred in them even deeper and deeper hatred towards him, and jealousy too. But the robe was a constant reminder that he, Joseph, was better than his brothers in the eyes of Jacob. Jacob repeats the same sin of his parents, right? If you were a diligent listener many, many months ago, you recall in Genesis 25, verse 28, that Isaac, the father of Jacob, and Rebekah, the mother of Jacob, they had different recipients of love. While Isaac loved Esau, Rebekah loved Jacob. So now we have Jacob replicating that, which is astounding because think of everything that Jacob went through with his brother Esau. All the jealousy, all the intrigue, all the drama, all the hatred, all the division, all the murder, right, that they were breathing against each other. Deceit, fight. That was the family dynamic because of that. Instead of learning with the mistakes of his parents, Jacob decides to follow on their footsteps over there, their sinful example. Now, unfortunately, there's nothing new here, right? Because we find the first patriarch, Abraham, developing some sinful habits. And Isaac, his son, just follows through with everything that Abraham did and piles up even more. And now we find Jacob doing everything that his father did, Isaac. It sounds like that the patriarchs can't learn. It sounds like that they're stuck in this vicious, sinful pattern that they are inheriting from their parents. There's no escape. Children apparently are doomed to follow the sins of their parents. But let me tell you, nothing is further from the truth. It doesn't matter, my friend, how evil, how bad your parents were or are. You as a believer, as a child of God, you have received everything that's necessary for life and godliness. 2 Peter 1:3. God has granted you everything that you need to change sinful patterns from the past and start a new spiritual legacy for the next generation. You are not stuck. You're not. There's no excuse to follow previous sinful behavior patterns. Well, Jacob followed the sinful pattern of his parents and was the cause of hatred and jealousy. But listen, Joseph was hated for other reasons as well, at least one more. Okay? Joseph was hated not only because he was a recipient of preferential love. Second, Joseph was the recipient of divine revelation. And he was hated for that too, right? And we read from verse 5 to verse 11. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. Verse 6, he said to them, hear the dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. What an outstanding message for his brothers. His brothers said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. To make matters worse again, he has another dream. And he tells his brothers, behold, I have dreamed another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? Verse 11, and his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. Basically, God gives Joseph two dreams here, right? Two dreams to announce that Joseph will become a person of great power. We don't know the details yet, but he will be elevated above his brothers and even above his parents. This power seems to go beyond, we know it goes beyond because we have read what comes next, but remember, they didn't know what was coming up. Right now, it seems that this power goes beyond the family, the exercise of power in the family realm, because everybody's bowing down before Joseph. Okay? It seems to be a social kind of power. Well, Joseph tells his brothers about his dreams. They don't quite like it very much. I don't know about you, but I grew up with two older siblings. I'm the youngest of three. I have a sister who is 4.5 years older, and then a brother who is only 18 months older than me. 18 months. We're very close. And that's a problem, right? If you grew up with siblings, you probably resonate with this, but I cannot remember. I cannot remember the day when my brother, for instance, conceded that I was right about things. I cannot remember the day when my brother came to me asking for my advice about life. What should I do, my younger brother, about this? Maybe you have a wonderful family dynamic, right? And that happened in your family, but in my case, even to this day, the idea that he, the older brother, should follow my lead is not very popular, right? I don't think he would appreciate it very much if I told him that he would bow down before me one day, and that I would have that sort of power before him. As much as I think that is very godly, he doesn't think so, all right? If you are the older brother, you might be saying that's all nonsense, but deep down you know it's true, right? Joseph tells his brothers about the dreams. Now, is he only trying to provoke them? Hey, listen to this. I am going to have power over you. What do you think of that? Well, again, if we keep reading the narrative, we get a good understanding of his character, of Joseph's character. He's not perfect. He's a 17-year-old. But he seems to be somebody who follows the direction of God to the point that God is revealing to him his will. And God will actually bless Egypt on account of Joseph. Joseph will be the channel of blessings to a whole empire. If you keep reading Genesis, you see the Lord was with Joseph. So I don't think he's necessarily provoking his brothers. Remember, he's only 17 years old, and he has 10 older brothers. Has it ever occurred to you that he might be asking his brothers and parents, hey, do you know what these dreams mean? Do you have any idea? Because I don't know. This is what the dream was. But it doesn't matter. He's not winning any kind of popularity contest in the family with the dreams he's been having lately. No doubt the brothers resent Joseph because of the content of the dreams. He's going to be elevated above them, but also because Joseph now becomes the vehicle of God's revelation. God has been talking to the patriarchs all this time, right? Abraham, then Isaac, and then Father Jacob. Now he's not speaking to Reuben, who's the oldest, or Simeon, or Judah, or Levi. He's speaking to the second youngest, who is Joseph, 17-year-old. So Joseph now becomes the vehicle of God's revelation. God reveals his will to Joseph, not to any of the older brothers. As far as we know, once again, Joseph has not requested any kind of revelation to God. He has not gone under a tree and said, God, please give me some special revelation. No, God, the dreams simply come. God has chosen him. What is he going to do? And he is hated because he's a recipient of God's revelation. Get this. This means that Joseph's relationship with God and the truth of God's revelation engendered hatred and jealousy in other people towards him. I'm not going to dwell too much in this, but Paul wrote in 2 Timothy 3:2 that those who want to live godly lives for Jesus Christ will be hated, will be persecuted. We cannot stretch this too much because the church is here a different organism than the family of the patriarchs, but regardless, piety, godliness are not popular in the world. And sometimes, unfortunately, not even popular in the church. And will cause hatred and jealousy within the church, within God's family. So believer, be aware your relationship with Christ and the claims of Jesus are not popular. They will generate hatred and jealousy even among those who belong to God's family. Keep that in mind. So the 10 brothers hated Joseph and were jealous of him because Jacob loved Joseph more than the other sons, and because God revealed to Joseph his plans to elevate Joseph above them all. And Joseph is about to find out that hatred and jealousy, they have legs. They are put into action. I don't think he knows this yet, right? But later he will understand that God sovereignly uses sinful actions of fallen sinners for the good of his people. First we have hatred and jealousy in the making. Now we have the second part of the chapter, which is hatred and jealousy in action. Now we see hatred and jealousy actually put into practice. And this goes from verse 12 to verse 36. All right? We're going to start in verse 12 over there, if you don't mind following along. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the men asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the men said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. They saw him from afar, verse 18, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come, let us kill and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." In verse 22, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him." But Reuben actually wanted to rescue him later. Verse 23, "So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, 'What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh.' And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it's your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. It is a long passage. I know that indeed. I'm going to go over this briefly, again in two parts. The first is the conspiracy itself. Okay, the conspiracy from verse 12 to verse 30. And what is the initial thought? Murder Joseph. Okay, we read in verse 18 and verse 20, "Here he comes, let us kill him. Let's get rid of him." Now, what is the real motivation behind it? We know that he was hated. We know that they had jealousy for Joseph, but and that was because of preferential love and God's revelation. But it sounds like from the passage that the real motivation for the murder, what was really bothering the brothers, was the dreams. Okay, because notice here, for instance, in verse 19, here comes this dreamer. And then in verse 20, the third part of verse 20, we will see what will become of his dreams. They're not bringing up the preferential love. They're bringing up the dreams. They want to get rid of the dreams. Okay, they don't want the dreams to come to pass. That was the real motivation behind the attempted murder over here. The dreams bothered them so much it has changed the way that they see the little brother. It's not Joseph anymore. It's the dreamer. Okay, so that's the emphasis over there. Thankfully, there's somebody who thinks is doing something wonderful over here. Somebody called Judah, and he comes up with his great idea. Oh, let's not kill him. Let's sell him into slavery. So that's what they do. Verses 26 to 28, they end up selling him. Why should we kill him? Let's profit, from this in the process. Because if we kill, we're not going to gain nothing. At least by selling him, they got 20 shekels of silver, which was the price of a deficient slave. So that's what they sold the little brother for, 20 shekels. And then in verse 31 to 36, we have the second part of that, which is the result of the conspiracy. Okay? We have more sin. Verses 31 to 32, they're now lying. They're covering up their actions with more sins. They're deceiving the Father. Don't be mistaken. Sin will generate more sin. Sinful pattern generates more sinful pattern. This is the logic of sowing and reaping. That's what Paul talks about in Galatians 5 and 6. If you are going to sow in the flesh, you're going to reap what? Sin and sinful behavior. If you want to change your patterns, your habits, your lifestyle, if you want to pursue godliness, you have to sow to the Spirit, in the Spirit, so that you can reap spiritual behavior. It doesn't help to just stop doing what's wrong. It doesn't help to just stop sinning. That needs to be replaced with godly behavior. So they started with sin over here, and sin just led them to a deeper and deeper pit of sin, further, and further. We also have the sadness of Father Jacob, right? He is now deceived. The deceiver is now deceived. What did Jacob do with his father Isaac, along with his mom, right? They deceived Isaac into blessing Jacob instead of Esau. Again, more sin. Sin generates sin. Jacob sowed deceit. Now he is reaping deceit. That is a warning in itself. Of course, there is distress for Joseph as well. So we have the impact, the result of the conspiracy over here. More sin, sadness for Jacob for many days. His mourning somebody who's actually alive. And then you have the distress for Joseph, who is now a slave in Egypt. If you want to include something else, you can talk about the guilt of the brothers, because we read in chapter 42, verses 21 to 22, Reuben flashing out the guilt that they have been feeling this whole time, right? And when they meet Joseph, they don't recognize him, but they think that they're going to die in Egypt. And what does Reuben say? We're going to die here because of what we did to our little brother. That's the guilt that they have been carrying. Again, sin generates more sin, right? And they believe that that sin that they committed is going to end up in their own death, right? Now, this is just a brief summary of the chapter. This, especially the second part, because we don't have enough time. I would like to spend a few minutes with you considering this narrative, because if we read this only from the human perspective, without considering the character of God, we will be hopelessly furious with Joseph's brothers for what they did. After all, Joseph seems to be a very nice guy. He seems to be someone who's doing God's will. He seems to be someone who's pursuing righteousness. He is someone whom God is speaking to and revealing His will to. So why does Joseph suffer this? Why is he suffering so much evil when he is somebody good? You may have heard the question, why do bad things happen to good people? That is a very popular question, and it's a question that Christians and non-Christians wrestle with. Okay? Now, I'd like for you to think briefly with me about this question. Why do bad things happen to good people? Because this question is popular, but it's misguided. And it's misguided for two reasons, and I want to emphasize that, okay? It's misguided because it has a faulty understanding, okay, of human anthropology from the biblical perspective. It has a faulty understanding of what the Bible teaches about humanity and who we are. It overestimates humanity and humanity's condition in the eyes of God. Because a big part of this question is, why do bad things happen to good people? We like to think that we are good. We like to think that we are upstanding citizens. We like to think that we have exemplary behavior. We like to think that because of all that, we deserve what's good. But according to Scripture, well, let me say that Scripture does not have a high estimation of you and me, spiritually speaking. Of course, we were created in God's image. We bear God's image and God's likeness. But that's corrupted. It's not lost. It's corrupted by sin and thoroughly corrupted. So when people talk about good people, it's not the biblical worldview that's taking place over there. They're looking at humanity from a different perspective, from the human perspective alone. And Jesus had to correct that perspective back in the first century. Somebody approached him and said, "Good master." What did Jesus say? "Don't call me good." "Why are you calling me good? There's only one good, who is God." Now, if you believe that I am God, then you can call me good, because only God is good. If I'm God, then I'm good. But don't be calling rabbis good, because no one is good. We read in chapter 3 of Romans that no one is good, no one seeks God, no one does what's righteous. Intrinsically, no one is good, no one naturally seeks God. That's the biblical truth about me and you as human beings. Ontologically, we are created in the image of God, but we are corrupted by sin. In all ways, we are depraved. So there's nobody good. The only thing that we deserve, again, the question, why do bad things happen to good people, presupposes that good people should receive good things, but God teaches us that the only thing that you and I as sinners deserve is the wrath of God. It's not what is good. We are not only called sinners, we are called children of wrath or objects of wrath in Ephesians chapter 2. And if we go to John chapter 3, verse 36, we not only get into the wrath of God, we remain in the wrath of God if we don't turn to Jesus. So, left to themselves, okay, human beings deserve the wrath of God because they are naturally evil. So the question is misguided from the biblical perspective when it comes to human the anthropology, okay? Who we are, all right? Don't get me wrong. We are wonderful creations of God, the apex of God's creation, because we bear His image. But we are depraved because of sin. Now, this question is also problematic because it not only overestimates who we are as human beings, it underestimates the nature and character of God because it leaves out of the equation who God is. It leaves out of the equation the sovereignty of God. And my friend, what makes all the difference in this passage over here, what makes all the difference in the way that we read this text is the truth that God is sovereignly using the evil deeds of men for the good of His people. It's the sovereignty of God that changes the way that we read the text. In this case here, God is using the sinful deeds of Joseph's brothers to ultimately preserve the offspring of Jacob. In the same way, what makes all the difference in the way that you perceive your life, your afflictions, your suffering, is the truth that God is sovereign. And we just sang about His sovereignty a few minutes ago. It is the conviction that God controls everything that happens. It is the conviction that nothing in our lives happens outside the supervision and decisive determination of a perfectly good God who determines all things in our lives to transform our characters according to the character of His Son. Romans 8:28-30. Now, what is left if we if we remove God's sovereignty? I would rather have no God at all than having a God who is not sovereign. Because we would be left to the mechanical results of our actions and interactions with other human beings. We would be left to our own whims, decisions, plans, and wisdom. Now, understand that God's sovereignty is not a crutch. Okay? It's not a crutch for us to find meaning and hope in the tribulations of this life. Reducing God's sovereignty to a crutch, I would say, it's cynical at least. The sovereignty of God is an understanding of His character informed by the way that God has been conducting human history and the life of His people as described in the Word. The sovereignty of God is not a doctrine that Christian theologians devised because they were desperately grasping for meaning, for life and suffering and hope. On the contrary, it is precisely the sovereignty of God that produces in us hope and meaning in this life so that we can go through afflictions. We get comfort from a God who is in control over every single situation. Of course, I do not underestimate the difficulty of this doctrine of God's sovereignty. Accepting this truth, especially in the middle of suffering and affliction. But God has not called us to measure up the size of suffering, but to measure the depth of His character. In His goodness, God has provided several examples in Scripture for us to look at and see that suffering does have meaning, that afflictions, they do have meaning when seen from the perspective of God Himself. And sovereignty does not preclude suffering in life. It comes with the assurance that the result is good for us. And God Himself has drawn my attention and your attention to His sovereignty in the middle of suffering, to His perfect character. And I'm finishing. I just want you to think of the life of Job, right? Think of Job. Job, described as a righteous man, he's hurled into suffering, undeserved, as we think, suffering. His wife is telling him to bless God and die. His closest friends are telling him, you deserve all this. It's your fault. You deserve all this suffering because obviously you're not godly. So he's frustrated with the friends, with life, and with God Himself. He demands an explanation from God. And God remains silent for most of the narrative. Finally, God shows up. And what does God do? Does God offer explanations for Job concerning his suffering? Does God provide logical explanations and calculated statements about Job's situation? No. God takes Joseph to his creation to show, listen, I have created all this. I am this all-powerful God who not only created all this, but controls all this. So now Job is understanding that the God that he knew only a little bit about God. After undergoing all that suffering, he has come to a fuller understanding, not complete, but fuller understanding of God. If God is capable of creating all this and sustaining all this, God is also wise and capable and powerful of sustaining my own life. So small compared to the whole universe. I don't think that at this point in the narrative, Joseph understands all that. He might. I don't think he does yet. He's still growing. But soon he will tell his brothers that God sovereignly orchestrated everything. God used the sins of his brothers for the good of his people. Do you find yourself targeted by others like Joseph? Then make sure it is for godly reasons instead of evil that you have done to them. The blessings of God often come disguised as afflictions. And finally, just as God, and this is for you to take home, just as God used the hatred and jealousy of Joseph's brothers to ultimately preserve their lives, God also used hatred and jealousy of the Jews to lead Jesus to the cross and save sinners like you and me.